Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us to come and talk to you all. My name is Yvonne and I work for the Association of Camarados, which is a little tiny organisation that supports the Camarados movement. And the basis of what we're going to talk about today involves quite a lot of work that has come from our public living rooms. My trusty sidekick is the very lovely Hayley Trowbridge, who we have worked alongside for several years now. And she wears a couple of hats. One is as an academic at the University of Cardiff in a section called Spark, and also as the person who introduced us to the joy of community reporting via the organisation that she leads, which is People's Voice Media.
Thanks, Yvonne. That introduces us, and what the first part of today's session is, I'm going to move on to just start us on a presentation that me and Yvonne prepared for a conference later in last year around how we used ripple effect mapping to look at how change works in local civil society. So this is like a little bit of a case study presentation before we go into the practical activities as we move on. So this is like part one of the day, a kind of traditional presentation before we get active. So I'll just start by giving a little bit of context to this. So we wrote this paper or this presentation in the context of post-COVID, or kind of like after COVID hit, let's say, because it's still with us. And what we kind of wanted to highlight was that whilst I think when the initial response to COVID was happening and the kind of institutions and the people who govern us were sort of slow to respond to the challenges that people were facing, what became very visible was how grassroots and small civil society organisations and groups really stepped up and began to make pivot very quickly and began to make changes that were really impactful for people. However, in saying that, these grassroots networks and civil society actors and groups and people were already there before. It's just that in the kind of, COVID period, these people became more visible to us and more kind of at the forefront of the innovation, or at least in terms of visibility. So what we wanted to do when we were working with Camarados was to have a look at how this really vital civil society work, the social capital work that happens within it, and those kind of maybe intangible or quieter impacts that aren't always as visible, how we can make them more visible. So we worked with Camarados to do a case study of how their public living rooms, which Yvonne will talk to you a bit more about, would be an example of how this often invisible or intangible but really vital community impact is being created. And one of my favourite quotes that came from this work is on the screen now, and this is from a Camarado who set up a public living room, who said it looks like we're sitting around in our asses and doing jack shit, but we're doing something. We're looking out for each other. It's a big thing and you can't see it from a distance, but it's there. And this is exactly the type of big impact on real people's lives that we wanted to illuminate through using ripple effect mapping. So I'll hand over to Yvonne now, who'll talk you through a few more slides, and then hand back to me whenever you're ready, Yvonne, and tell me next slide when you want to go on to them.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So for those of you that haven't heard of Camarados before, or what the concept of a public living room is, I thought it might be just really helpful to tell you super quickly what they are. So like I said, I work for the Association of Camarados that supports the Camarados movement. And that movement is built up of lots and lots of people who create public living rooms with their community, in their community. And it's all about making sure that we've got those connections amongst us so that when times are tough, we can get together and get through them a lot easier than we would otherwise. And when Camarados was set up, we did some testing over a 2-year period as to what that could look like. And we worked with some psychologists to make sure that what we were doing wasn't going to cause any harm, but it also helped us understand what was really important to the people that came along to our initial testing spaces. And what came out of it was that people felt that the spaces were very mutual in how they conducted themselves. It was about everybody being on a level, everyone being equal in the space and looking out for each other in a very mutual way. And how we describe that then got transposed into our 6 principles, which you can see there on the screen. And they are really how we feel people can be more human in their interactions with one another in their everyday and at work, but also specifically when they're in a public living room. So what makes a public living room different to other connection spaces is that they are not doing 2 or doing 4 spaces, they are doing with, and everybody mucks in and helps to create them. They're there for people to listen, to have fun. There are no judgments in those spaces, and perhaps what's really unique about them is there are no fixing spaces. And what we mean by that is that, you know, they're not an onward referral space. There's nobody there that's going to be coming in with a risks and needs assessment in a public living room. It's about just rocking up, turning up as a human being in amongst others. Think a bit more akin to a book group rather than a formal, organised, safe space. We don't tend to use that word. We tend to use human space instead. Hayley, please may you do the next slide. So we've been partnered with Hayley and the team from People's Voice Media for a few years now, and we originally began using community reporting as a tool to find out the impacts of our public living rooms. As an organisation, we've never been about surveys or traditional data. We've always wanted to have a look at what the impact is on behaviour and people's interactions. And so that's why the community reporting appealed to us, because to understand and hear people's stories is to know what is happening for them from being in one of our spaces. But we tried to put that down in a way to look at our overall impact, and we felt that there was just something a little bit that needed to be added to that, and we just through some research stumbled across this concept of ripple effect mapping, which was set up by some folks in the United States, and I think Hayley's going to talk a little bit about that shortly. And what we decided to do was combine the technique of collecting of stories through community reporting with carrying out ripple effect mapping sessions in our public living rooms. And we did a mixture of them, actually, because we weren't sure what would work the best. So we held some online, we did some in group sessions, we did some in person, and we did some with people on their own. But what was evident from all of them was that this technique really did start to capture all of those intended and unintended changes that were happening through the connections people were making in public living rooms. We didn't select which public living rooms attended. We put the offer out to everybody, and they came forward of 18 ripple maps in our first year of doing them, and we've just done another section of ripple effect mapping, and I think we've got another 17 or 18 maps from this year as well. So we're now starting to collect quite a lot of data from with a good geographical spread. So the data that we're talking about today, the information, has come from the public living rooms that you can see there named on the slide. Next one, please, Hayley. So I just thought it might be quite handy to see what one can look like. So there is no perfect way to do a ripple map, because how you draw it is all to do with how you feel the information comes out of your mind. It's what we do with it after you've drawn it that's important. So you can see on here that there's a couple of thought processes that have happened. So if we look, there's a bit on improved mental health. So we've grown the team, we're living the principles, and coming off of that, you can see what that growth in team looked like. So someone called Maria, someone called Pauline, someone called Charlotte, and someone called Nicholas, and someone called Paul. And then the ripples then come out from those individuals, and you can see how that connects all the way across all of the others, including linking to learning new languages, breaking down barriers, more engagement in activities. So just from one sort of simple question that you ask yourself, this is the effect that you have, the drawing that you can create. Next, please, Hayley. So we thought it would be useful to have just a quick look at some of the things that we found out from our ripple effect mapping that we did over a year ago, just to give you an example of the kinds of things, and particularly the themes that tend to come out when you do this exercise. So it might be lovely, I think, for you to listen to one of the interviews that happened when we did the ripple mapping, because if they were done online, we were very fortunate we were able to record them. So we will send you these slides so you can listen to them both. But from a point of view of the audio that's probably the clearest, it might be a good idea to listen to Tony. So I think Hayley can press play and we'll have a listen.
I've been talking to a woman online because she does some poetry since lockdown and whatnot. And she, at the time, was living in Wales and recently moved to London. So she doesn't know a lot of people in London, and she's living in South London. I'm in East London. And I told her about the public living room and like, come along, and she come along. And one of the things you couldn't see, I drew a little dog because she brought her little dog with her. And she ended up talking to another woman who is quite isolated and more from social phobia than anything else. But she came along and I didn't introduce anybody. I just invited loads of people on, and they ended up chatting and really getting on and changing numbers, and there's some beautiful pictures with them. But that principle that you mentioned, Maria, about mixing with people who don't look like you. So the age difference in these two people was so different, and that, you know, they just probably wouldn't have come across each other, but the garden was the perfect setting.
So I think what Tony is showing us there is a few really lovely ripples from the work that Camarados does. The first one I'd sort of like to pull out is the fact that public living rooms are no agenda spaces. We just get people together and we don't facilitate anything for them, and that means it's a very natural way to make connections with others. And so these women ended up chatting, and they ended up swapping numbers, and then ended up making a friendship. Now, we perhaps wouldn't have known that had gone on to happen if we hadn't been able to ripple map the behavior. And then the other thing that it showed for us is that one of our principles was being used in action, because we all have our aims and our desires and our goals as organizations, and finding out that actually one of them is working is magnificent. And so ripple mapping has been really important for us in that regard, because, you know, we have these principles, we know they work, but are people really using them? And ripple mapping has been able to show us that they are. Thank you, Hayley. So what we have found actually is that ripple mapping helped us to identify some of the conditions for change that have come about through public living rooms. So we know that it showed us that people really needed to have one sort of person with a fire in their belly to get a public living room started and to get that going. And then perhaps a group of self-motivated individuals to be around to enable that to carry on. And that was really fantastic learning for us, because it has helped us to shape the resources that we've been given to folk in the movement moving forward, but also any sort of on the side training or help that they may need to help to run their public living rooms as well. It really highlighted the importance of low thresholds. So there's lots of us on this call, I think, that are in the business of wanting people to connect, to combat isolation, or to look after their mental health. And what Ripple Mapping showed us was that public living rooms have a really have a low threshold for people to cross, particularly those that are held outside, like the one that Tony was alluding to in the garden. There's not a door that has to be walked through. There's not a form that has to be signed or a referral that has to be completed for you to be able to attend. So it helped us to show that. Existing social capital. I think sometimes there needs to be some before a public living room comes along, because you're going to need some connections, at least at the beginning, for it to be able to work and to begin. But also, they then get built upon quite quickly by the folk that come along to the space. And then lastly, visibility. In terms of getting things seen, getting the idea out there, and people understanding what this concept is, it showed us that word of mouth, that being a presence on a street, that just being able to walk through a space with no other expectation on you was really important. So the conditions for change for public livings to work really are those four things. And that's what Ripple Mapping showed us. And it was really, really important for us moving forward with our resources.
Thank you. I'm just going to move on now to share with you some of the impacts that our colleague, Dr. Lauren Thompson-Wallis, came up with from this initial set of maps. And I probably imagine that the maps we've been working on more recently probably add further impacts and further evidence of this. So when we when Lauren analysed the work, analysed the maps, we did it by looking at the different levels of impact, whether it was at an individual level, an organisational level, or a wider society level. And from the maps, what we identified was the key impacts, as you see on your screen. So at an individual level, it might be things like people talking about an increase in confidence, or that they learned something new, or that they had a sense of purpose, or were more connected to people. At an organisational level, we saw kind of like changes in attitudes happening that kind of made organisations more human, like they were working with communities in different ways than they were. There were also new links between organisations that the kind of public living rooms were cultivating as well. Some even noted down that they had an increase in volunteers because they were doing public living rooms, so people found that environment somewhere that they could connect into and get in and access other opportunities. And also opportunities for fundraising came up, so a new way of doing what they're trying to do in the world, but with more innovation. And I think, to go back to the other side, the no service here style approach was what was hanging there. And then in terms of society, across the community, people were reporting decreased social isolation, so not just in one person, but across a few people connected to that living room. The space in which the public living rooms were being held, whether they were outdoors, indoors, they didn't feel like a service, and it felt community owned. It felt like a community asset. And what we've seen on the maps also is that public living rooms are making other people, like not making forcefully, but making in a influencing way, set up more public living rooms. So people have been to one and thought, oh, I want to do this where I live, and are going setting them up. So in terms of what the maps showed us in terms of how change happens, because this is one of the benefits of ripple effect mapping, which we'll come on to when we talk about the method in the activity part. it showed us that there were two core catalysts of change when we analysed the maps for the kind of change journeys that people and organisations went on. So the first one was that they encountered the principles, and that set them on a task, kind of change journey, in which that changed mindset and behaviours and what people would do and their actions therefore. The other core catalyst of change was meeting new people, so people connected with others, and this led them on to different types of activities. We were also able from the maps to start coding some of these dynamics of change, looking at individual behaviours, what were kind of changes in feelings or mindsets, relationship changes, and kind of collective actions that were changing. And what we produced from this was something what might look like a little bit like a metro map, what showed how these changes were often interconnected and interdependent. The slightly faint yellow dash lines are the changes we think it is making as well, what there seems to be indicative or kind of alluded to evidence within these initial maps that these kind of further changes are happening. And I think as we maybe look at the maps that we've gathered subsequently, there's probably a bit more evidence of some of these changes. Like we would think that if people were more connected to other people in their area, that there would be an improvement in community well-being. We just wasn't confident enough to state it from the small data set at this time, but it was not such a leap of faith to suggest. So finally, to move on to just some conclusions from the presentation of the insights, at least, is what did we learn about how social capital can be nurtured? So one of the things was that the purpose of the movement was the key common goal that kind of gave the context for nurturing social capital through the public living room. So that shared purpose of being part of something bigger than yourself and bigger than your one public living room was really key. The second part was the principles. They provided the blueprint for creating the relationships of trust that enabled that nurturing of social capital and impacting the communities. So there was evidence, as Yvonne pointed out, just from Tony's story of how one of the principles were working. There was evidence throughout the map about multiple principles and how they were help creating that space. And finally, in the map, there was a sense of ownership that people felt that they could adapt the public living room to their own context. And there was a sense of mutuality and a kind of joint sense of motivation. This wasn't an organisation getting people to sign up to a kind of aim that only that suited the organisation. It was much more of a two-way process than that, and it felt not top down and not as directed, and that individual ownership is something that was really important. So I will stop sharing there for now, and I think we have probably got time for 2 or 3 questions, I think, Yvonne, and the group on the findings. Any questions on method, just hold on to them. We're going to talk through the method and give you a practical activity that you can experience it and get to know it in a moment. But in terms of the findings around how those less visible, often less tangible impacts are being created, and the learning that we took from this study, we'll be open to a few questions on that before we move on to the actual method and the taster. Kat, come on in.
Hello, happy Friday, everyone. Sorry, I came in ridiculously late. One of those overrunning meetings things. This is one of those where, you know, when you kind of go, oh, it's a workshop on a Friday afternoon, really? And then you go, oh, but it's the Camarados and it's ripple effect mapping. So yeah, why not? Thank you very, very much for what we've heard so far. We've set up a public living room in Bury. I don't think it's yet on the map. I suppose my question is part question, part provocation. There's always a danger that when something like this works and it works really well, the system kind of comes and eats it up. And there is always that risk of you know, it gets turned into a manual, and it gets turned into like a bullet point of how to do. And then somehow the ownership moves somewhere else. And then that level of, you know, being deliberately a bit shit and being deliberately not massively organized and being deliberately open in that it goes where it goes, gets kind of boxed up and almost like sold off. So how do we go about not letting that happen? What conditions can we put in place to really, really protect this?
Is that kind of I guess that's at me as I work for Camera Riders. Hello, Kat. Lovely to see your face. Well, I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is that well, it's trademarked for first, which sounds really kind of but actually we're so convinced by our principles and our idea and how we've created it and the research that has gone into it, that we have effectively tried to protect it because in that way, because of exactly the thing that you mentioned, Kat. One of the things we do talk about in the office is that we're not instead of the system, because the system does brilliant things. We're just alongside it, and we're just something different. So we have, as a movement, no ambition to move into the system whatsoever, because they're already doing their thing, and that's great. What we want is just to have a different offer. So if people want to come together and do it for themselves as communities, then they can, and it's there, and we can help them to do that. And sure, if there's someone on here, because I heard a few people say they work in social prescribing, so it could be those who are social prescribers amongst you. If you know there's a public living room nearby, you could just say to whoever, oh, well, you should bob along there for a cup of tea. And I think that's the kind of level of interaction that we would probably expect with the system. Kat, I hope that explains and allays what you were thinking.
Nikki, do you want to come in? I think might be our final question for now. But
yeah, guys, it's not really a question. It's just with hearing Yvonne speaking, then it made me think about here at the Big Life Group. We developed a service called The Sanctuary back in 2013. It was ahead of its time. It was a kind of community space. It was very similar to, well, the concept was around crisis mental health, but in the community, and providing a very safe space, like a living room really, but it was actually a kind of living room, not outdoors as it were. And we never took the time to, well, we did some research, but we never actually published the research. And so what happened was, up and down the country, then the NHS started to develop, and other organisations, some actually even use the same name. And when we didn't have a problem with it, because actually just wanted to help people get the right help. But there was something there about doing the research. And, you know, if I was to have my time again, I definitely would have published. So I don't know where you guys are up to, but it sounds like you've got a really, really lovely concept there that's helping a lot of people. So, and you're on this research journey. So yeah, I think as third sector people, because we're so busy doing the doing, we don't often have the time to then go and shout about, or in this case, publish, do we? So I just really wanted to.
Yeah, thank you. Rather interestingly, Hayley and I are working on a paper.
A proper one.
Brilliant.
With proper academic referencing and stuff. Shay, if it's a quick question, I think we'll take it now, then we'll move on, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's just it's a quick one about community, because the project we're looking at is community enhanced social prescribing, and we kind of, it's always really hard to capture something so nebulous. And I was wondering, when you talked about the community impact, what kinds of things were you finding in your interviews that were showing changes to the community beyond people who've just been involved in the living room project?
Well, so I'm looking at some notes here in front of me that I've got. So, for example, it would have been, people may then have gone to set up other groups that perhaps had interested them. I'm trying to find you on my screen. I've got a plethora of people. Oh, you're in the middle. Hi there. So we've got examples where people had met in a public living room. They then decided, actually, we're both interested in this. Wouldn't it be amazing to have a group or something set up for that particular interest? So off they went and did that. Or people would have figured out who in a community knew about various things like childminding or the food bank or food pantry. And so they would then help one another out and take them to that space. They then would talk about joint community projects, and then perhaps volunteer for those community projects because they had been in the public living room and connected. They also would then go on and tell the neighbours in their street, who may then go on and tell other people about the public living room, who then made wider connections. So those are the kinds of sort of ongoing society community impacts that happened. I mean, if I give you I've got a quote here from someone in Wigan. There's someone on this call from Wigan. I don't know, someone said they were. Hello, whoever you are. One of them was, conversations had come about which then led to improvements in the local park. So they met in the public living room, they had conversations about what they wanted and what they needed, and then that led to direct action to a facility happening in their local park. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, thanks.
Fabulous. Suzanne, can we leave is it a question or
just a quick comment, because it just relates to the discussion that's going on about wider community impacts. And it sounds like, from what I've heard, that the people participating, they really, you know, they also got some skills that they could then take and start other things with. And this is totally in line with this whole social capital and schools for democracy argument, you know, that some people have made about voluntary organizations. And so it's really interesting to see how that how that worked in practice in your initiatives.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Sorry to herd everyone on, but we want to make sure that we get to talk a bit about the method and to at least give you part of the taster activities that we had planned. We're always trying to jam too much into a Friday afternoon. So I'm going to screen share again, and I'll talk you through a little bit about the method, and then Yvonne will take over and take us through the first activity, where we get to go off camera a little bit and do a bit of ripple effect mapping, just to have a taste of it and experience it ourselves. So I will just share my screen again. Is that coming through for everyone? So we'll go on to our taster activity, but just a little bit of method stuff first. So basically, as Yvonne said, this came from methodology was developed by some folks, Shasden et al. Full references are in the slides when you get sent them, over in America. And ripple effect mapping is basically a participatory impact evaluation technique that was specifically designed for community interventions and community projects. So it's not an impact measurement technique that has been reappropriated from another space and brought into the community. It was designed with community interventions in mind. And in short, and I guess what, as Yvonne showed you earlier with one of the example maps we brought along today, is it basically involves people who've been involved in an intervention or a community project or a process, whether that be like a community garden, a food share project, I don't know, painting benches in the park, whatever it might be, green spaces. It's about those people coming together and the different stakeholders to reflect upon and visually map both the intended and unintended changes that occurred. So it's about looking at what that started that change, and then where the ripples of impact went on. So a bit like cause and effect, but lots of different cause and effect, or as I like to see it, a bit Diana Ross. So chain reaction is basically what people are mapping. And it's really important that those people, the people who've been involved in it, so it's about their experiential understanding about how that change has happened, not about somebody else looking on, deciding how that change has happened. And it's designed in this way to capture the ripples of impact that are not measurable via traditional methods, the type of stuff you wouldn't measure by counting how many people came along to an activity. So you might be like, oh, 50 people from the community came to this activity, but that wouldn't tell you about the conversations that Yvonne was talking about that then led on to activity outside of the session. It might only tell you about what happened in that particular session. So it's about those kind of ripples effects that happens from the original intervention, i.e. the public living room in this case. So it's concerned with contribution. So how is an intervention or an action or a policy changing an outcome or a system as a whole? So it's looking at what we can say as being contributors to that change. It's rooted in appreciative inquiry. So it starts from what has been achieved, that asset-based approach of what is there, what has happened, rather than what hasn't happened and what isn't happening here. It's adapted to different contexts. So it's been used in health settings, as we've used it in public living rooms now. It's been used in community garden projects, volunteering. I'm applying it to study an intervention in the university that I work at, that's creating an innovation community. And it can be done iteratively or summatively. So you could do ripple effect mapping at the end of a project. If you've got a 12-month project, you could do some ripple effect mapping towards the end, or you could do ripple effect mapping at various stages in a long-term change project, so you get a longitudinal understanding of where those ripples of impacts are going. So core benefits, why is it useful? It highlights the experience of communities and the people who are part of the change and are people who feel the impact on the ground. It helps us demonstrate that impact basically on a level of people and place. It also supports us to learn about how change actually happens. We sometimes have an idea at the start of a project or a theory of change that we do this, this will happen, and then that will be our outcome. What ripple effect mapping enables us to do is to go, is that actually how change is occurring, or are there other routes that change is happening? And therefore, how can we support those routes that are naturally occurring rather than the ones that we're trying to engineer? And finally, and I think this was the thing that maybe, wouldn't say shocked, but maybe me and Yvonne wasn't anticipating, let's say, when we started this, was the activity of the mapping itself celebrated the achievements of people who were connected to the public living rooms, and people were quite emotional sharing back their maps at the end of these sessions, through pride and through maybe starting that some people started at the point of, oh, it doesn't make a difference, I've not done very much, to the end of the mapping going, oh, I've done all that with these folk around me. And it's kind of like that sense of achievement. And a lot of people felt really motivated to continue their grassroots action. And I think that's one of the powers of this method, is that it makes it really visible the importance that people at a grassroots level are having on the community and themselves and the people around them. And I think that was a really key part of it. So I will hand over to Yvonne, who will tell us how we're going to do some ripple effect mapping now, and do a bit of activity off camera.
Hello. So this is where we all get a bit of a chance to take part in doing a ripple effect map. And please don't worry that there's one particular way it has to look. You've already can see there's a different shaped one here than the one I showed you earlier. But in essence, we're going to create a spider diagram of the thoughts that occur to you when you think about a project, an intervention, or an organisation that you are involved with. So what I'd love you to do is to think about something that you have done recently. Either it could be one small part of a project, it could be your entire project, it could be the role that you do at work, it could be an activity that you have put on, or it could be the organisation that you work for as a whole. Once you've thought of that in your mind, on your piece of paper, what I'd love you to do is write what that is in the centre of that piece of paper. And then, using just one colour pen, please, I want you to create a mind map of everything that you can remember that has happened that has come out of that project. So I'll give you an example. We do something called pavement public living rooms, where we put a public living room on the street and we see what happens in a given day. A few months ago, I did one on the streets of Reading. And whilst I was sat on the streets of Reading, several things happened. There was a homeless lady who was sat nearby us, and someone walked past her and threw a glass of orange juice all over her and all over her sleeping kit that she had next to her. The public living room was nearby, so she came over, introduced herself, and asked if she could sit with us while her kit dried out. She sat with us for 2 hours. And in those 2 hours, she met a lady who was a refugee who was currently living in one of the hotels in Reading and who was out shopping. She'd been to one of the charity shops to try and get herself a pair of new shoes because she only gets £8.50 a week. And so she was finding herself a new pair of shoes. And her and the homeless lady got talking. And they spent an hour in one another's company, and then they parted company and off they went. So the ripple map from that short exchange would be the pavement public living room. The fact that it was visible and it was there meant that the homeless lady who had something awful happen to her had somewhere to go and sit. When she had somewhere to go and sit, she then also had a bit of company. And I'd like to think that in that company, she had an experience that made her feel that there was a human being out there that maybe cared a little. And the other lady, the refugee, did as well. So that gives you what I hope are 2 examples. One is a known change. The lady who was the homeless lady had somewhere to sit and she had company. And we know that happened. When we look at the potential for what might have happened, we can say possibly that she went on to feel better about her day because she'd had that company. So that's the difference between what I would say as a known and a firm line and a potentially happened as a dashed line. So when you're doing your ripple maps and you're doing your spider diagram, as they come out from your central circle, that's what you need to do. If something you know has happened, you draw a straight, firm line. If you think it has happened, it's a dotted line. Hopefully, that explains what you need to do. Here are some more examples just to show you what I mean by that. So the person in the middle just says that she's a camarade. If we look out from some of the firm lines that she's coming out, she went to Bench Hill Public Living Room, and from that, she made friends with somebody called Colette. So those are firm lines because that's something that definitely happened. If we look at this one was done in a public living room by a group of people in Stonehaven. That's the other joy of a ripple map. Everyone can do it at the same time. And you can see that the way they did their firm lines with their volunteers, I've come to meet new people, I came to come out of the house. So you don't have to just stick to writing lines. You can do it in bubbles as well, if that's what you like. Right, next one. And here's another one with the same sort of principle. More men engaged than usual. No agenda meeting space, it reduced isolation. This one doesn't have as many dotted lines on. These ones all seem to be quite firm. But use those as kick-off points to the kinds of comments you need to be looking at.